There was one that said, I believe there was but as I saw actually.
I was surprised.
I've got the
Commission to discuss the preliminary results of the license renewal environmental review for the Sequoia nuclear plant. Well, good evening to everyone. My name is Bob Hager. I'm a member of the NRC's Meeting Facilitation Corps. And in this meeting, my role really has three parts. One is I'm going to try to keep us on track, help this meeting run smoothly. I'm going to ensure that everyone who has something to say in this meeting has an opportunity to say it without interruption. And I'll try to keep us on schedule. I'll do my best to make this a meeting worthwhile for everyone who's here, and I hope you'll help me do this. Before we get started, I want to cover with you a few details about this meeting. First of all, you know the Tennessee Valley Authority has applied to renew the Sequoia operating license. The NRC is reviewing that application, and as part of that review, they're reviewing the environmental impact of license renewal. The NRC has developed some preliminary results of that review, and they want to tell you about those results today. And they want your comments on those results. That's the primary purpose of this meeting. Now, the meeting is going to have essentially three parts. The first part is going to be the NRC's presentation. They'll talk about the license renewal process. They'll talk about the environmental review. Now, copies of their presentation were on the table outside. If you didn't pick up a copy on the way in, you can certainly pick them up on the way out. And following the NRC's presentation, we'll take a few minutes for you to ask questions and for the staff to give you answers about the presentation materials. Because it's real important that you understand the environmental review process and the results. And so we'll have questions and answers about those materials. And then following that, we'll have the third part, which is going to be public comments. Now, when you checked in, the staff asked you if you wanted to speak, and if you did, you filled out a little yellow card. And I've got several of those now. If during the presentation you decide you want to speak and you didn't fill out a yellow card, don't worry about it. When we get to that part of the meeting, I'll ask for if there's anybody else that wants to speak, and if so, we'll give you a yellow card at that time. But then that's when you'll have an opportunity to provide comments. Now, during that period, the NRC staff will listen to your comments, but they generally won't respond. Instead, they'll take your comments, and take them, your comments are going to be recorded. They'll take those comments back to headquarters and prepare written responses after the meeting. And they'll refer to the appropriate documents, talk to the right people, make sure they get the best answer to your questions. And then they'll include their responses in the report of this meeting. And that meeting will be, that report will be available online. Now, the NRC has arranged to have this meeting recorded. That's so the NRC can produce a transcript. That's a record of what was said during the meeting. In order for the transcript to be accurate, we need to establish a few ground rules to ensure the recording is clear and complete. So first of all, when you speak, you need to speak into a microphone. And we've only got one microphone for you to use, and this is it. So if you have a question, I'll call you up to the microphone, ask you to speak your question into the microphone, and then I ask the NRC staff to come up to the microphone and provide the responses. That way, both the question and the response will get recorded. Now, the first time you speak, we'd ask you to please identify yourself, and if you represent a group, identify the group you represent. Also, if your name is relatively uncommon, or if it has an unusual spelling, it'll help if you spell your name too. Now, to ensure that the recording is clear, please minimize background noise and don't hold side conversations. Especially, please silence your personal cell phone and any personal electronics you have with you. And if you now recognize you may not be able to completely disconnect yourself from the rest of the world during this meeting. And if you do need to stay connected, and if you receive a call during the meeting, please step out in the hallway to take that call, so that the phone ringing doesn't show up on the recording and your conversation isn't part of the record either. And to ensure that the recording is clear, please don't hold any side conversations. Mentioned that, yeah. And Because if you hold a side conversation and the microphone picks up two people talking, we can't tell what either one of them said. Is everybody okay with these ground rules? Okay, thanks. When we get to, now I mentioned the yellow cards, and I think I got 3 of them so far. When we get to the third part of the meeting, I'll call up speakers in the order in which I have them on the cards. And if you, like I said, if you decide during the meeting you want to speak, just let me know and I'll have you fill out the card. Also, out on the table, you may have noticed there are meeting feedback forms. We'd appreciate very much if you would fill out one of those feedback forms and give us your assessment of this meeting. Give your form to any NRC staff member before you leave, or if you take it with you, you can drop it in the mail, and because it's postage free. And your assessment of how tonight's meeting went will help us improve future meetings. So please take a minute to let us know what you think. And finally, the restrooms are just outside this door across the hall. Emergency exit is outside this door and to the right. If for some reason we're going to have to exit quickly out the door and to the right. And security members are located sitting in the back, and they'll help us if we have an emergency. Do you have any questions about anything I've talked about? All right, I don't see any hands. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to David Drucker. He's the Environmental Project Manager for the NRC's review of this Sequoia license renewal application. And I'll be back when we move to the second part of the meeting. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. And as Bob mentioned, I'm David Drucker. And I want to thank you all for coming out to the meeting tonight. And I'd like to introduce my boss, is Brian Whittick. He's sitting back here in the second row. We're both from NRC headquarters back in Rockville, Maryland. And I hope the information we provide with this presentation will help you understand what we've done so far and the role you can play in helping us make sure the final environmental impact statement is accurate and complete. I would like to emphasize that the environmental review is not yet complete. I'd like to start off by briefly going over the agenda and the purpose of this presentation. I will discuss the NRC's regulatory role, the preliminary findings of our environmental review, which addresses the impacts associated with extending the operating licenses of the Sequoia nuclear plant for an additional 20 years. And I will present the current schedule for the remainder of the environmental review and how you can submit comments outside this meeting. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers on the contents of my briefing, and most importantly, time for you to present your comments on the draft Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement, the acronym for which is SICE, so you'll hear me refer to this document that we've developed as a SICE. Next slide, please. The NRC was established to regulate civilian use of nuclear materials, including facilities producing electric power. The NRC conducts license renewal reviews for plants whose owners wish to operate them beyond their initial license period. NRC license renewal reviews address safety issues related to managing the effects of aging and environmental issues related to an additional 20 years of operation. In all aspects of the NRC's regulation, our mission is threefold: to ensure adequate protection of public health and safety, to promote common defense and security, and to protect the environment. Next slide. We're here tonight to discuss potential site-specific impacts of license renewal for the Sequoia nuclear plant. The Generic Environmental Impact Statement, or GEIS, examines the possible environmental impacts that could occur as a result of renewing licenses of individual nuclear power plants. The GEIS establishes and bounds the significance of these potential impacts. The analyses in the GEIS pertains to operating power reactors. For each type of environmental impact, the GEIS establishes generic findings, covering as many plants as possible. For some environmental issues, the GEIS found that a generic evaluation was not sufficient and that a plant-specific analysis was required. The site-specific findings for Sequoia are contained in the draft sites published in July of 2014. And I have both hard copy and CD of that draft site on the table just outside this room. This document contains analyses of all applicable site-specific issues, as well as a review of the issues covered by the GEIS, the Generic Environmental Impact Statement, to determine whether the conclusions in the GEIS are valid for Sequoia. In this process, the NRC staff also reviews the environmental impacts of potential power generation alternatives to license renewal. Next slide. So for each of the environmental issues that are examined in the draft sites, an impact level is assigned. And the NRC's standard of significance for impacts was established using the White House Council on Environmental Quality terminology for significant. The NRC established 3 levels of significance for potential impacts: small, moderate, and large, as defined on the slide. For a small impact, the effects are not detectable or are so minor they will neither destabilize nor noticeably alter any important attribute of the resource. For a moderate impact, the effects are sufficient to alter noticeably, but not to destabilize important attributes of the resource. And for a large impact, the effects are clearly noticeable and are sufficient to destabilize important attributes of the resource. While these impact level designations are used for most of the resource areas analyzed in the draft sites, there are 3 areas that have their own impact level designation, and these are discussed on the next slide. So for special status species, the impact significance determination language comes from the Endangered Species Act, and the choices to describe the impacts are no effect, may affect but not likely to adversely affect, and may affect and is likely to adversely affect. For cultural resources, the Natural Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. And for environmental justice, under Executive Order 12898, federal agencies are responsible for identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental impacts on minority and low-income populations. So in this slide and the previous one, I kind of defined for you what the impact level designations are going to be, and now we're going to take a look at that, both the cumulative impacts first, and then the site-specific ones at Sequoia. Next slide, please. So as a part of the environmental review, the NRC staff considered cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts include the effects on the environment from other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future human actions. So others, the key word there, other is other than Sequoia, because we'll look at that in the next slide. These effects not only include the operation of Sequoia Nuclear Plant, but also impacts from activities unrelated to Sequoia, such as future urbanization, other energy-producing facilities in the area, and climate change. The analysis considers potential impacts through the end of the current license term, as well as the 20-year renewal license term. The cumulative impacts on all resource areas were found to be small, with the following exceptions. First, the cumulative impacts on surface water would be small to moderate, primarily due to long-term surface water warming associated with climate change. Second, the cumulative impacts on terrestrial resources would be moderate, primarily due to increasing urbanization. Next, the cumulative impacts on aquatic resources would be large, primarily due to the historical changes to the Tennessee River since the early 1900s. And the cumulative impact on global climate change would be moderate, primarily due to present and future global emissions of greenhouse gases. Next slide. So we've taken the broad view, we've looked at cumulative impacts, things that go far beyond the Sequoia Nuclear Plant, and now we're going to look at the site-specific impacts at Sequoia Nuclear Plant of this license renewal. And that's what this slide lists. It's the issues that the NRC staff reviewed for continued operation of Sequoia during the proposed license renewal period. And so for each of these areas, there are scientific experts, if you will, and for example, in the terrestrial resources, we have a terrestrial biologist who would look at those resources. And each of those areas is backed up by folks who do those areas for a living. Overall, the impacts for license renewal on these issues were found to be small, which means the effects are not detectable or are so minor that they neither destabilize nor noticeably alter any important attribute of the resource. Next slide. The National Environmental Policy Act mandates that each environmental impact statement consider alternatives to any proposed major federal action. A major step in determining whether license renewal is reasonable or not is comparing the likely impacts of continued operation of the nuclear plant with the likely impacts of alternative means of power generation. Alternatives must provide an option that allows for power generation capability beyond the term of the current nuclear plant operating license to meet future system generating needs. In the draft sites, NRC staff initially considered 18 different alternatives, then narrowed those to 4 alternatives and considered those 4 alternatives in depth. Additionally, the NRC considered what would happen if no action is taken and Sequoia shuts down at the end of its current licenses without a specific replacement alternative. This alternative would not provide power generation capacity, nor would it meet the needs currently met by Sequoia. The NRC's preliminary conclusion is that the environmental impacts of renewal of the operating license for Sequoia would be smaller than those feasible and commercially viable alternatives. Continued operation would have small environmental impacts in all areas. The staff concluded that continued operation of the existing Sequoia nuclear power plant is the environmentally preferred alternative. Next slide. So based on a review of likely environmental impacts from license renewal, as well as potential environmental impacts of alternatives to license renewal, the NRC staff's preliminary recommendation in the draft sites is that the adverse environmental impacts of license renewal for Sequoia are not great enough to deny the option of license renewal to energy planning decision makers. Next slide. The draft SICE does not discuss potential environmental impacts for storing spent fuel for an extended period after the plant shuts down. For the term beyond the 20-year period of extended operation, the NRC addresses the management of spent nuclear fuel in the continued storage final rule. On August 26, 2014, the Commission approved publication of the continued storage final rule and the generic environmental impact statement that supports it. Under the final rule, the environmental impacts of continued storage are generically determined in New Reg 2157, titled Generic Environmental Impact Statement for Continued Storage of Spent Nuclear Fuel, and codified those findings in NRC's regulation at 10 CFR 51.23. And therefore, those impacts do not need to be determined on a site-specific basis, and that's why they're not addressed here in this draft SICE. Next slide. I would like to re-emphasize that the environmental review is not yet complete. Your comments today and all written comments received by the end of the comment period on September 29th will be considered by the NRC staff as we develop the final SICE, which we currently plan to issue in March 2015. Those comments that are within the scope of the environmental review and provide new and significant information can help change the staff's findings. The final SICE will contain the staff's final recommendation on the acceptability of license renewal based on the work we've already performed and any new and significant information we receive in the form of comments during the comment period. Next slide. As many of you know, I am the primary contact for the environmental review. Manny Sayak is the primary contact for the safety review. Copies of the draft SICE are available on CD, as I mentioned, in the entryway. And in addition, the 3 libraries shown on the slide have a hard copy available for review. You can also find electronic copies of the draft sites along with other information about the Sequoia Nuclear Plant License Renewal Review online at the website shown. This is, I think, the second slide I've shown with a website, pretty long, hard to write down from sitting where you are. And so also out on the table in the entryway are these slides, copies of these slides, so you can get the websites from those slides available to you in the entryway. Next slide. So the NRC staff will address written comments in the same way we address spoken comments received today. You can submit written comments either online or via conventional mail. To submit written comments online, visit the website regulations.gov and search for docket ID number NRC-2013-0037. And if you have written comments today, you may give them to any NRC staff member. If you choose to put your comments in online at regulations.gov, when you go onto that website, you get to see anyone else's comments that they've made. And also, there's a copy of the D-sites there also, if you want to see it. This concludes my presentation, and I will turn the meeting back over to Bob. Thank you all.